you and I about this, but kind of give an update of where these folks are at. They had 5 companies that responded to the RFP. The decision was to interview 4 of those companies. The one that they did not choose, at least let's call it they're sidelined at this point, is Matrix. The 3 that have been interviewed are Consolidated, which is a private-public partnership that requires some significant investment from the towns. Charter, which is another public-private approach, and they are expecting nothing from the towns at this point, largely because they're penetrated heavily in those towns. So they're just going to kind of wrap it into their complete build out across the state. And then there's GWI, which is a BUD approach that also requires a significant investment, whether that be from the BUD itself or from the towns. And that's kind of a brief overview. I don't know, Claire, if I might have missed anything there.
No, I think that sounds right. And we've met with each of those internet service providers to have like a follow-up interview after they submitted their proposal. The only internet service provider we still have to meet with is Sebago Fiber.
And do you have that scheduled?
Not yet.
Not yet.
And I'm assuming that's a private-public partnership with some town match or a BUD.
Well, it's a private-public, but there's still some, at least on my part, there's some confusion as to exactly what their approach is. They did respond to the RFP, but as I recall, it was a bit confusing. For me, I don't know if anybody else has any comments about that or any memory as far as what their offer was, but I think the interview partly is required for them to clarify some of that stuff. So
I think they were pushing whatever it is you want to do, we'll do it.
Yeah, right.
That was the sense I got from that.
Yeah. Hence the confusion.
Yeah.
And Kendra Jo, I know you'd requested this meeting, and I know it's partly in part for you to maybe get a feel from the committee here as to, you know, where they're leaning, what some of their comments about some of these providers. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if that's what you're looking for, we can ask the group.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming together on short notice. I think that's most of it, is kind of understanding where the group is and your pathway forward. If that feels like establishing a utility district, you know, there's some steps that can be taken there that are, you know, a fairly light lift of standing up a utility district, and you can do so without deciding to, in the end, go down that path. But it is, you know, a couple weeks of paperwork and submissions to stand up a utility and get interlocal agreements moving forward. And, you know, if there's a pathway towards a viable project, either with an incumbent or a non-incumbent project, I just wanted to check in ahead of the Connect the Ready round and kind of see where you all are and what you were thinking. And so it's good to hear you've already had some interviews and at least one remaining. Was there a reason you didn't want to move forward with Matrix for an interview?
I think it was mostly cost, and also that they don't, I won't say they don't have a reputation, but they're not well known compared to the other providers. Again, I don't want to speak for the committee, but I do believe that was sort of the feeling is, you know, let's move forward with the familiar companies, and not that they won't interview Matrix. It's just that was sidelined for now.
Okay. Yeah, and that's it's not the first time I've heard that, kind of waiting to see how they establish themselves in Maine before um, moving forward with other communities. So great. Yeah. I don't know if you all would like to share your thoughts on kind of your next steps and how you keep moving forward, or if you feel like you're leaning towards, a set of decisions that lives outside of a funding path stream. Um, just an overall check-in.
It probably is safe to mention too, Claire, I'm gonna forget his name, but the marketing guy from MCA that we,
Dan,
yeah, you two
Yep.
know who he is. I forgot his name. But he did a very good presentation, and I think it helped the group kind of get an understanding of the path to communication back to the towns, back to the selectmen, having sort of a congruent and well-packaged communication, as opposed to having meetings like this and just everybody going back individually and, not maybe having the same message. So just thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I appreciate you all utilizing his skills and service. And where there's funding through GP Cog, if there's any opportunities for you all to have community check-ins and conversations, sharing back to your communities the results of the RFPs, or the conversations that you're having, and just kind of creating and generating more community engagement and awareness as you continue to move forward. I'd love to hear any of that.
Yeah. So we did have Dan come to our last steering committee meeting, and he put together a sort of a draft communications plan for us, that we can use to plan out the next 6 months, which I think was helpful. I think right now what we're sort of struggling with is figuring out, like, we have all these proposals. We've sort of gone through them as a committee, had interviews with folks. We have our criteria of the different things that we want those proposals to fulfill. But I think we're struggling a little with the transition from like making that decision as a committee to like bringing the communities up to speed so that they can have like buy-in on those decisions, and figuring out like at what stage we talk to community members before like going to them too soon and not having all the information and causing like more confusion. So that's something that I think Dan's going to help us a little bit with, making like a message document. But I know that's a conversation we've been having for the past like month or so, as we've started wrapping up these interviews with internet service providers. So any advice on like how other cohorts or communities have done that, sort of transition from like it being mostly committee focused and then to getting the larger community involved?
Yeah, so some have made their conversations with the RFP respondents public and just put it on a webinar format. So, there wasn't participation from the community, but they could listen, or they've recorded it to go back, and if people were interested in watching and getting that information, because I think there's a less about confusion and more about the community or the select board feeling like they were still a part of the decision-making process, can be yeah, I think it mostly depends on your municipal government and the way your community involves themselves in decision-making. So if they want to kind of be brought along at every step and kind of know every single detail before a decision is made, or if there's that trust between that the recommendation coming from committee up to a select board and to a community has been thoroughly vetted and verified, and has done have done as much due diligence as possible. And if someone was wanting more information, there's a place publicly that they can seek that information, whether it's on a town website or a broadband committee website. I think just always having the opportunity for someone who has more questions and it wants to get in the weeds a little bit on how, especially if you, well, I would say if you do or don't go with an incumbent provider, right? If you do go with an incumbent provider, then there might be someone who says, well, we hear about all these projects that are like DBU and ownership models. What did you even look at those? And then you can point to those pieces and say, yes, we did. And here's how we, came to this decision. Or if you don't choose an incumbent provider, it's, well, did you even talk to, right? And you can have had a few public meetings. You could have had public sessions where you were, more than happy to invite community members or select board members to the conversation. And someone will still ask that. Did you even talk to CCI or whoever your incumbents are? So I think the more just public documentation you can have of the process that folks can dig into on their own is always useful, and really just continues to support the work that the communities and the committees in this regional collaboration have done. And I think laying out the pros and cons of all of your options instead of just presenting the one, right? That you look down multiple paths. I can share I think I've shared this before with you, Claire, at least, but I'm happy to share it again. I feel like Vinyl Haven did a really good job of sharing just really succinctly, sharing all of the information that was received and kind of that pros and cons and why they ended up choosing what they chose, and really positioning those as the cost benefit, but the benefits leaning towards accountability and revenue generation and control and ownership and sustainability for their community versus, I guess a lack of, as well as for looking at like a municipally owned, they also did a really great job of taking a really large number and making it individual. So you could see kind of based on your tax valuation of your property to the $100,000 and the current mill rate at the time, that was your monthly cost increase. If the project ever had to hit your tax roll, there was a monthly cost increase. So I think at most it went up $12 a month for one of the highest properties in the community. At the lowest end, it was like $1 or something. But it took a really large multiple $1 million number and made it into that individual, this is how it impacts you as an individual, as a homeowner, every month. So that they could kind of combat the messaging around, you're just going to increase my taxes. And when you see like a $5 million, say just roughly $5 million project, you think it's going to increase my taxes by a lot. But for them to kind of pinpoint and say, at most $12 a month. But then here's how you can cost save on your connectivity budget, because the cost of internet might go down, your voice over IP could replace your telephone, and that could be a cheaper cost. So they did a lot of work around making the recommendation as individual as possible, or how that recommendation impacts the individual, I guess. So I'm happy to share some of those tools again, if that's helpful to see. And that's, specific to one. They obviously chose one model to present to their community, but they, I think it could work for any model, even an incumbent that's asking for funding, right? And how that might impact the individual as well.
Could you share that with me too, Kendra Jo? I would love
Sure.
to see that. I think the one thing that Dan impressed upon the group here, thank you for reminding me of his name, was that going back to your, community, your select board with, let's say, a decision where you, where the group has kind of come to a conclusion, the fallout from that or the blowback from that is that the committee and the community may say, well, where did we have input into this process? Where, why weren't we asked about these things before you went and made a decision? So what Dan, I think, did really well presenting is how you bring them along, right, on that journey, and how that gets done going forward and who does it and that sort of thing is still in question, I think. But again, to your point about it's just about the communication. I mean, if you know, did you say Milo? Is that who you said the example you gave?
The example I just gave was Vinyl Haven.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, it just sounds like maybe they had a decision that they were trying to just, already decided and were pitching to the community.
Yeah, so they made what they did was they took all the RFP responses and they did a broadband campaign. So they did some surveying work, and then they shared the benefits and challenges of all the RFP responses, particularly the models that were proposed, and made a recommendation on top of that. So based on all of this information, this was the recommendation they were putting forward.
Got it.
Now their select board could say, not the one for us. Their committee could say, not the one for us. Come back with your second recommendation or your plan B. But that was kind of the pathway that they took.
All right. Thank you.
How much more complicated is that when we're looking at 5 towns as opposed to 1? Because we're going to be trying to come up with one model for 5 different towns. I mean, it might not necessarily happen that way, but that's kind of one of the hopes.
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on the model that you decide on. And if you were to decide on an incumbent provider, I think there's probably an easier pathway. I wouldn't say that it's the easiest pathway, but there's probably less barriers to moving that forward through your communities, just based on assumption, but I could be wrong because I don't know your communities. And then there's probably more work around a 5-town public ownership model, whether that's a utility or not. And just in the sense that, like, with a utility model, you would need interlocal agreements. You'll need an MOU with that provider. You'll need to stand up a utility. So there are some just legal and technical pieces that come with that model as well. Interlocal agreements do go to town vote, whereas an MOU can go to just your select board. So an MOU even with an income provider would just be through your select boards. So I think it a little bit depends on the support you currently have of your communities and how you've brought them along to date. Especially if they have shown interest in one model versus another, or or investing investing in a model, whether that's a private-public partnership or a full publicly owned network. I mean, my assumption is that there has been, and I welcome the opportunity to hear more. But my assumption has been that your communities are aware that you're working together as 5 towns towards a broadband solution, and that there's been some surveying and community informing work done to inform around your goals and align the goals across all 5 communities, and take opportunities to reinforce and reiterate those goals across all 5 communities. Where it's hard is when communities are working together but not aligned on what the goals of the work is. So if one is particularly looking towards a certain technology than the others, or they are looking at a certain very much valuing a certain model over the other communities, that's where it can be a little more difficult. And I would recommend kind of a reflect and realignment around that. But if all of your communities are very much aligned on what your top goals and priorities are, then it does move forward a lot, I would say with less effort. But you are trying to bring 5 towns together around a project. And each one of the models kind of brings their own challenges and benefits. And I would like to think that the benefits outweigh the challenges, but it can be difficult. You aren't the first five, you aren't the first group of communities to try to do some of this work. And I think we've been learning from each regional collaboration and how much communication is really needed to keep those 5 communities together and moving down a path, so that when you do get to an opportunity of decision making, you can make those decisions together.
I think the information from the Vinyl Haven recommendations would be key for us, because we all agreed early that one voice from the collaboration was so key, because there are 5 towns and we have to agree in this room first before we even approach our selectmen. So, once we get a feel for what we all agree on, then we can really start creating our message to our individual towns as one. And that's really kind of key, I think. I don't know what everyone else believes, but we have to really agree in this room first, and get our message as one voice. So I'd love to see that Vinyl Haven recommendation. That would really help.
One point I really heard that I really liked is where you talked about, again, it's an educational aspect and trust development, is here were the 5 RFP recipients. Here's the strengths, here's the weaknesses. And as we come forward with the recommendation, we say, here's why we recommend this. And you can actually put out in a public forum what's the strengths, what the weaknesses are, and then you can have that dialogue. But I agree that we with John, that we have to have some agreement in this room first before we start that one messaging.
And I know before I joined this, before I joined Mission Broadband and this group, that there was some work done by Mission Broadband that's similar to what you're saying, right? That's a comparison sheet. It gives, kind of the bullet points of the pricing and then the model and describing the model. And I'm going to try to find that and resurrect it. And that would help guide, exactly what you were just talking about, Tony.
That would be really helpful.
Yep.
And I'll apologize to the group if it's creating some repeat work. Casco was late to the dance, so some of the stuff you might have already done, I just might not have seen.
No, Tony, I don't think you're late to the game at all. We had a document similar to that Mark Van Loan created, but I think there still needs to be work done. Like, I can find it and send it around. I can send it to you, David. I think it might need a little updating at this point, but I think it was somewhat hard to digest. Like, I think there still needs to be work done as like making that a document that like we could share with community members and they would like understand. I think it was a little technical, which was good for this group, but I think there's still definitely work to be done as far as like articulating the strengths and weaknesses in a way that like people can really understand on a community level.
Yeah, you're remembering the same document I am, and you're right. It to be something that a community can digest, or even this group, to be honest with you, it needs to be a little more, what's the word, less technical, and more pros and cons on just the benefits of each of those. I do, Mark did a good job, but there's just a lot of stuff that can be peeled out of that and replaced with more simplified messaging, I guess is the point.
So could these things go into, I missed the meeting, but I watched the meeting that Dan was in. Could this go into the power show or the video that they talked about at that meeting?
Yes, it could.
Yeah, I think we talked about, I think like one of the biggest takeaways from that meeting was trying to create like some sort of message document, whether that be like
that we could share.
a 3-pager, PowerPoint, something that each town has to like share with their select boards and stuff like that. So I think, Mary, I think that would be great to put into that like message document.
And make it accessible to, online somehow where, Jerry's talking to somebody in the community and he can just say, hey, go to this website and check out this video that we made, or this PowerPoint that we have. It'll explain a lot. And any one of you could use that.
I mean, because I think it would be good even for us as a committee, Sebago has a pretty big committee, to share, like, invite people to our town hall to see and talk. And so that it's transparency, is something that's really important in our town.
Well, to add to Mary's point, we have an interesting immediate need for something like this. Because we're a growing town and we have a lot of underserved. I've done a lot of community discussion. Spectrum's charging our newest community members up to $8,000 to $10,000 to get hooked up, because there's no lines in the new areas of town. So they're telling them that they'll reimburse them if they get other members to hook up with them. But we need them to understand that it's coming. You know, we're working on something. So look for other alternatives, maybe SpaceX or something, because it's creating a lot of anger, to be honest with you. I really like to get as much messaging out to the people as we can, as early as we can, because this is for Sebago, it's a big issue. It's just not, it's in the mountains, so to speak.
Yeah, and we have a lot of underserved and not served.
So
I think one of the things we can do, even in casual conversation, is talk about some qualities, the qualities of we interviewed or will have interviewed 4 vendors. We will present pros and cons on all 4 vendors, so you will have that opportunity. There are things like that that are broad-based but show intent of being open-minded.
Yeah, I think that's the intent of the document that Claire and I were just talking about, that we need to revise and make it a little clearer. Actually, John, I do have what you mentioned was, I know an old model, I'm going to call it an old model that the charter used, which is basically going out and saying, okay, you live 1,000 feet off the road and it's going to cost you, $6,000 to get our service. With this new approach and the grant funding and serving the underserved or unserved, I know with other customers that we work with and spoken to charter, that they if there are poles there, they'll serve you. So I mean, are you talking like driveways that are 1,000 feet long that may not, I mean, they must still have poles because they have to get electricity to their homes, but it's more about the access, and they're a little more willing, and Kendra Joe, you might be able to speak better to this than I, but they're a little more willing than they used to be, right? Where they would say, oh, you need to get 5-year neighbors to defer the cost, and we'll do this. Now there's a little more impetus on serving those unserved and underserved, and they're taking a bit of a different approach, which is less expensive to the end user. If that makes any sense.
It depends on if the fiber was run on the main streets that serve the areas. And one of the people I talked to, they relaxed it. Once they said it was 8,000, but the area was growing, so they pulled that back. But I just spoke to another gentleman last week, and he's rural, and they did not back off because there was no fiber run anywhere near him. And he went to SpaceX. He just wasn't going to spend the money. They wanted to basically charge him to run the main line, and that wasn't going to happen. So I guess what it is there's some people that feel they have no choice to get the service, and they're building their homes, and they kind of build it into their construction costs. And I think that there's something to say, well, wait a minute, make some angry people if they're going to spend that money and find out we're doing this project. And
Well, go ahead.
so that's where that came from.
Any other comments or things you would like Kendra Jo to know specifically, given she is our face and voice of the MCA?
That's what I was going to ask in terms of Kendra. What are the boundaries around you in terms of what's your responsibility and what's not?
So I'm the community capacity manager. So I I serve as our community engagement and lens across all of our programming, including non and infrastructure programs. So I bring back perspective and voice from communities into our work and try to ensure that we are doing community driven approach throughout all of our programming. And then, externally, I am the support for community capacity building and resources. So I can speak to most things. I can speak at depth on a lot, but there are areas or questions you might have that I will defer to someone else and connect you with one of our other staff members if it's specific to workforce or digital equity or even one of our infrastructure programs, depending on what the question is. So when it comes to communities, I don't know that I have much guardrails because I'm the person, but it's yeah. So I lead the get ready work and all of our planning and capacity building work for the community side and kind of bridging that and balancing it with the private sector partnerships.
Okay,
I don't get
thanks.
asked that often what I do for my job, so usually people don't understand it anyway. But fortunately, you guys at least know what broadband means. Yeah, so I will just flag that this afternoon there's a Connect to the Ready Cohort 2 feedback session. It's at noon. And it's an opportunity if you've reviewed or plan to review the program guidance that just came out. It's currently in draft form, so we're looking for feedback on it, particularly the areas that we have changed, which include eligible locations, financial contribution, and partnership collaboration. So and universal service proposals. If you do have feedback, we would prefer it in a more specific way as it adheres to your or impacts your project or your community. That way we can get a better understanding of kind of how it would play out for you specifically. So the program guidance, the draft is linked on our website. I can throw some of this in the chat. And that event is today, and it's going to be recorded. If you can't make it, that's okay. So let's see here. So I'll just put this in the chat real quick. So if you just go there, you'll see our program draft guidance is linked as you scroll down the screen. And this is the link to register for this afternoon. Again, that's today at noon. And I think if you register, you'll get the copy of the recording regardless, but then the recording will be posted on our website as well if you can't attend this afternoon. And it's open to providers and community members and consultants and partners. So we'll have a mix of everything on the call. This is, I believe, the only virtual feedback session we're having before guidance goes to our board or gets revised and then goes to our board. It'll go to our last mile infrastructure grants subcommittee first and then our full board on the 23rd. So there's a little bit of time between now and then. If obviously, if you haven't heard about this until this moment, it's short notice to read a program guidance document that's fairly long. If you wanted to email, you could email me any feedback or questions you have as well. And I know David has been in the program guidance and sure that he has some insights as well if you have questions.
Yeah, I actually, I think I told you yesterday, I have a 2 or 3 page compressed notes and highlights of the guidance, and I can send it around to the group. Actually, Kendra, before we all leave this meeting, I guess I'm still a little confused on so the next cohort, the next grant round, this particular community, these communities are 95% penetrated by a certain provider. And the other 5% of that is largely in Sebago, right? So it's sort of it's separated out. Can these folks or an ISP apply for the grant for that specific unserved area only? In meaning that if because if you took it as a whole, I would think the authority, the board would just look at that and say, you're 95% penetrated, and we need to focus on other areas that are less, that have more unserved. But if you have this setup where you can kind of carve out the unserved and apply for that only, does my question even make any sense? But
No, so I'll respond and you can tell me if I responded to the right question. So given the competitive nature of our last grant round and the depth and scope of the unserved locations across the state and our priorities, we are, and this is a smaller grant round, so this was only $20 million, which is less than half than we had before. We are targeting the unserved locations, and those are eligible. We right now, in the draft guidance, and this is subject to change a little bit based on some feedback we've already received, but locations that will be eligible are those unserved locations, and we're not separating unserved and least served. Just unserved locations are eligible. You can build through an underserved area to get to those locations, and there's an understanding that you might pick up underserved locations on the way. So all of that is eligible. There is a cost benefit, or a cost, a cost benefit of that build, right? It would make your cost benefit a little bit higher. But the universal criteria is trying to urge providers to not just pick out small portions and say, we're going to go there, we're going to go here, we're going to go there, across the state, and leave these large swaths of underserved behind. So the universal criteria is, in conversations with several, if not all ISPs, the conversation was, how do we leverage their private investment and potentially community partnership to build out a full universal area, whether that's a community or a region. And given that this private space has told us for a long time that the reason unserved locations are continuing to be left behind is cost. So if we are subsidizing the cost of reaching those homes, how do we make that a part of a larger project? The larger project will not impact the cost benefit analysis. It will impact whether you get the universal scoring. And there's a discussion right now if the universal scoring should be a weighted score or a gating criteria, so that all projects that come in have to be a universal project, have to be a full community scope or region. We're still discussing and welcome feedback on how we define what a universal area is. So for your situation, is that one individual community? Is that all 5? And if a provider can't do all 5 communities, then that's not universal. So there's still discussion around that. And again, if it should be a weighted point or a gating criteria coming in, part of that is we just had Reach Me, which is line extensions. And if we didn't have that universal service point, this starts to feel more like a line extension program. Right. So the way that we see these funds going as far as we can to really bring those that have been unserved and left behind for so long up to a served status is by being a little bit more purposeful and directive, and also recognizing the last cohort, we, even with more funding, we didn't have enough funding to cover, to get into the communities that had a higher percentage of underserved. So trying to be more explicit about basically what the outcomes of that first cohort were anyway. And because we heard feedback from folks that came through that program and were in that preference group 3, that 51% or higher of underserved. Of, you know, if you knew we weren't competitive, you could have told us up front. And I don't know that we knew that until we saw the applications come through and there just be over, you know, over double the amount come through than we actually had available to award. So that's where it stands right now. And, you know, again, you know, how it impacts communities and the decisions that you're making. I'm open to hearing some feedback on that. So.
Oh, that was helpful. Thank you.
Hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, yes, it did. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, it's been tricky in the past when, you know, projects come in that are highly underserved, but we, you know, there's always the conversation of, would this build happen anyway? You know, would the build have happened? And it came through ReachMe as well. You know, we have to look at the projects and try to understand if providers are coming in for funding because there's funding available and they're just trying. But they would have built it anyway with their own private funds versus they really need public subsidy to be able to build or extend or upgrade. And trying to balance that a little bit and doing so a little blind because we don't know the work plans and the strategy of any individual provider. Some days I wish we did, but we don't.
I need some help here. And David, you asking this question really helped, but how do we perceive the town of Sebago? How do we address that large underserved, not served area and still be part of a consortium which has other, which has a larger scope?
Yeah, I don't know if David, you have an answer. I can.
Well, I was just going to, you mean a community that has a larger penetration of served. So you're attached to a consortium of highly penetrated served folks, where Sebago just happens to be one that is largely unserved. And what's the impact of either going it alone? I'm just wondering if this is your question, Jerry, going it alone, or do you stay part of the community? Which is going to be more advantageous to getting the grant money for a town like Sebago? Is that your question?
Well, that's certainly part of the question. That's an obvious question that people will be asking us, and we need to be able to answer that. But it's just the idea of, it seems like there are some mechanics here that make it more awkward for us to participate here. And yeah, I want to be careful because I'm not trying to influence it and say we're going it alone, but we need to know how to proceed as part of a consortium with that unusual burden there.
Go ahead, Kendra. Joe, if you want to.
Oh, sure.
I
I mean, I don't know that I can give you a definitive answer or make that choice for you. You know, I think if the match capital is there, it doesn't change a lot of the perspective because, again, the underserved locations don't impact the cost benefit. They do impact whether or not you get a universal scoring as outlined right now. So what we didn't want to do was ask for universal projects and then, you know, and then it negate the cost benefit of that overall scoring. So, so similar to in cohort 1, so I'm trying to not make you confused. in cohort 1, there were preference groups, and there was scoring within those preference groups, which allowed for ranking, but the amount of funding we had kind of drew a line at preference group 2. But those preference groups were broken down by the percentage of which you had unserved, least served, unserved, and underserved locations. And so having more underserved locations negatively impacted the eligibility within the preference group ranking. Then once you're in a preference group, all of the other scoring factors and criteria impacted how you were ranked within it. Without those preference groups, which is what we're doing in cohort 2, we don't have those preference groups because we're saying we want to see universal projects, but we don't want the underserved locations to negatively impact. It does mean that the partnership, whether it's the community alone, the community and private partner together, or the private partner alone, needs to cover the cost of upgrade and build out to those underserved locations. And that you would be coming in for subsidy to, so in Sebago's case, you'd be coming in for subsidy to those unserved locations. If the funding exists on the private-public partnership side for the full scope of the region or for Sebago as an individual, it doesn't really, my assumption is that it's not going to directly impact the weighted scoring of that project.
Okay.
Right. But it's about, do you have the capital to cover the cost of the remainder of that project, whether that be Sebago alone or all of the communities together. And again, that capital can come from that match capital, or project capital can come from, any version of that partnership, whether it's all in the community or the utility, whether it's a mix between the private and the public partners, or if it's solely on the incumbent provider. So in the Spectrum case, it sounds like they aren't asking for funding from the communities. It would be solely on them to cover that full scope cost of the project.
Well, and that's a good segue to what John was saying, right? So we've been in situations, Mission Broadband, with other customers that say that want a definition from Spectrum or Charter that says what is the underserved. So Spectrum comes in with their RFP response and they say, hey, we're going to cover your whole area. We're already 90% there, 95% there. At our cost, we're going to cover the rest of you folks unserved. So John, to your point, that's why it's imperative that if that's a direction that this group goes, to hold Charter's feet to the fire, lack of a better term, to determine what's unserved to them and what's unserved to the MCA and what's unserved to this committee, and make sure that everybody is cohesive and agrees on what that means. Because it is simple for an ISP to come in and say, hey, we'll cover you 100%. Oh, except these and this and this and this and this, we won't, because it's going to cost us too much money. That has to be defined. Again, if the selection is a Charter type ISP, that has to be defined. And it's not easy. It hasn't been easy with the other customers I'm thinking about, but it does have to be defined. So to your point, Kendra Jo, I think this is more of a line extension situation for this particular group of communities, based on the stuff we've been talking about. They intend to build it out anyway, most likely. So if that's the case, then I don't see where this particular group of communities in this would really fall into any beneficial universal sort of approach that would get you grants, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And yeah, I'll stop there, but hopefully that made sense.
I have a quick question just to kind of put the whole Sebago thing to bed, I think. Now, we have about 10% underserved. I don't even think that'll probably measure up to other communities looking at underserved. Does that seem about right? I mean, I'm looking at people looking for funding underserved. They're going to be higher percentage than 10%. Am I on the right thought process there? Kendra?
Underserved or unserved?
Well, those are I'd say, is it unserved, Jerry, or underserved? I
So,
think,
so unserved is less than 100 over 20. So you're talking DSL down to no service, or satellite, etc. Underserved, you're talking cable provider, 100 over 20 up to, but not reaching 100 over 100.
no, I'm gonna say that we're underserved at about 10, maybe 20%. So I don't know if those numbers hunt with what the preferred treatment would be. Because if they don't, there's no point even looking.
I think
Or
we're, I think we're starting to define what the group will ultimately agree with. And
Well, I guess my point, Jerry, is that Sebago is going to ask the question. We got to answer the question by just saying it's just the path that the probability of it happening is just very, very minimal. And let's stay in the collaboration. I mean, and we just got to be able to shut that down.
I think what helped me, Kendra, was when you said that serving a pocket like Sebago won't adversely affect the other 5 towns.
Yeah, I don't think that Sebago would adversely affect, if anything. Well, and again, I'm not looking at like the map and the data, and I'm following kind of, David, what you're saying is that right now, what would be most competitive under a Connect the Ready would be would be a provider, public-private partnership, whatever model you so choose, but let me change perspective for a second. I think it's more helpful to look at grant funding as backing into grant funding. We're looking for projects that are bringing forward the capital to cover the underserved locations to make a universal project, and you're backing into grant funds. So you have that capital established, whether it's provider, communities and provider, or just community or utility district, whoever is owning or whatever that partnership comes together to figure out what the capital stack looks like. And then for those unserved locations, wherever they are throughout the communities, or wherever they are throughout this region, that's the area that is most needed for subsidy. It's why they continue to be left behind, is because there's too much of a high cost to get to them, whether it's density, rurality, whatever it is. So you would be seeking grant funds to offset the cost of those premises because they've been deemed, not profitable or too costly to extend to. So regardless of network, regardless of partnership, it's bringing the capital forward to be able to cover the cost of that full build. And again, the scope of that could be single town, multiple town, region, and you'd be looking for subsidy to offset the cost of those. And then the competitiveness comes down to how you stack up to other applications. And that's what I can't tell you because I don't know what the other applications are.
Right.
And so when you're reading and reviewing the RFPs, when you're talking about recommendation, it comes down to, would the communities as a whole or the provider or together both be able to cover the capital cost to get you in the door, either through the match funds or making sure that there's a full universal project. And again, I think a little bit of that comes down to how the final draft comes out. Like, on the universal piece, for instance, is it a gating criteria where we are only reviewing universal projects? Or is it just a weighted scoring point, an extra point or X number of points? I forget what it is in the program guidance right now for having a universal project. And so, a little bit of it gets down to an unknown because we don't know the scope and depth of applications that are going to be coming in. And that's only if you're seeking Connect the Ready funds right now. Again, under future funding like BEAD, any unserved location that remains is going to have to be addressed by BEAD funding. And that where we made the decision around our program guidance right now, BEAD funding is very clear from the federal government of where we can and can't put those funds. And they do draw the line differently on unserved locations than we do on an underserved. So, and that's a conversation for the future. But I just want to clarify that as well. So hopefully that helps. I do have a hard stop at 10. So if you have more questions for me, feel free to ask. You can also follow up with me by email and I can throw it in the chat if you don't already have it.
No, thank you, Kendra Jo. Thank you. I also have a 10. But I think one of the takeaways is for Claire, if you could, I mean, the folder that we have for GPCOG is pretty big and I have a hard time finding some things, but if you can find that comparison that Mark Van Loan did, I'd appreciate that. And I'll turn that into a document that you folks can hopefully use for your communities. And then we can talk more on a committee meeting about next steps based on what Kendra Jo has talked about here. So thank you. And last call for questions or comments. All right. Thanks again, Kendra Jo. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Kendra Jo.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you.